So this is a continuation of Chapter 6 on cartilage and bone tissue, and we're going to focus specifically on bone in this video recording. We've already talked about cartilage in a previous one. So you'll find that there are some similarities between cartilage and bone, as well as lots of differences. Starting with the fact that bones are living organs. They are considered organs because bone is, bones that we could name, the femur, the humerus, and so forth, are made up of bone connective tissue. So we'll talk about that connective tissue here, which is remember, one of the supporting connective tissues. But in addition, a bone that you could name also contains connective tissue proper. Dense irregular connective tissue makes up the outer covering of bones called the periosteum. Cartilage is found at the ends of articulating bones. That's articular cartilage. Smooth muscle is found in the walls of blood vessels that do penetrate bone, so bone is vascular, unlike cartilage, and contains fluid connective tissue within those vessels, as well as epithelial tissues that line the blood vessels. Nerves also enter bone, so we've got nervous tissue in bone, as well as reticular connective tissue that lines bone marrow and helps produce red and white blood cells. So by naming all these tissues, we can then conclude that bones are organs, and they are living organs, dynamically responding to any sort of changes in the environment based on, or because they have a dedication of other kinds of tissues found within. Bones have a rigid extracellular matrix that results from a term we call here a calcification, which is where calcium and phosphorus salts are deposited on collagen fibers. So that process is referred to as calcification. And therefore bones serve as a reservoir for these minerals. And so calcium being then accessible by blood to blood or by blood as needed for things such as muscle contractions, for blood clotting, and to help with nerve impulse transmission. Phosphate is also has a physiological purpose, is needed for ATP synthesis, for example, as well as DNA synthesis, and of course there'd be other things we could list there. Lipids are also found stored in bone. So these are things that we could say are stored with bone. So bone has a storage function. Lipids are stored in yellow marrow, which is found within the medullary cavity of the diaphysis. And we'll see what all of these things are shortly here. Bone contains red marrow, which we just mentioned here, which produces red blood cells or has the role of hemopoiesis, and yellow marrow to store fat. The flat bones of the axioskeleton, such as the ribs, sternum, and skull, vertebrae and os coxae, and the proximal epiphyses of the femur and humerus are responsible for hemopoiesis, or where hemopoiesis occurs. And then to support and protect vital organs, such as in the cranial cavity where the brain is stored or housed, the thoracic cage where the heart and lungs are housed, and the vertebral canal where the spinal cord is housed. And then, of course, providing movement. So these bones serve as sites for muscle attachment. And when those muscles contract, then they move anything that is attached to them, such as our bones. Now, bones are classified according to their shape, and there are various shapes and, of course, sizes of bones. And they're listed here: long bones, short bones, flat bones, and irregular bones. And we'll take a look at them in the figure that's next. Long bones tend to have greater length than width. So examples would include the humerus, the radius, the ulna, but also the metacarpals and even the phalanges. That distal phalanx, as small as it is classified as a long bone because it has longer. It's longer than it is wide. Short bones have equal length and width. So the tarsals of the foot, the carpals of the hand are all considered short bones. The patella is a short bone. There we go. The patella is a short bone, but it's also considered a sesamoid bone, which is a floating bone because it's contained within tendons and ligaments and so forth. Flat bones are shown, for example, here in the skull, the cranial bone here, the frontal bone, but also the ribs are considered flat bones. The sternum is a flat bone, and the scapula. Irregular bones, well, back to flat bones. Flat bones, we'll see the anatomy of here shortly, contain two layers of an outer and an inner layer of compact bone with a layer of spongy bone in the middle. Irregular bones are more elaborate, and they can't be really classified into any of these other categories. So for example, the os coxae here would be an irregular bone. Vertebrae would be irregular, as well as a couple of our skull bones, the ethmoid and sphenoid, which we'll learn about more in the next module. Now we concentrate specifically on long bones because we are looking at the appendicular skeleton primarily in this module. And so there are some characteristics that we want to highlight here in the figure. So they're listed here because they show up in your lecture outline, but we'll look at the figure to make sure we mention all of these. So in a long bone, there is the shaft is the diaphysis. The epiphyses are at the proximal and distal ends here, these sort of larger, wider regions, more complex structures there. The outer lining of the diaphysis is called the periosteum, and it is composed of dense irregular connective tissues. We'll see a little bit more about that shortly here. We have a little bit of periosteum highlighted on the right. So it's, again, dense irregular connective tissue forms a fibrous layer, and then there's an intercellular layer that we'll talk about. And the perforating fibers are just collagen fibers that help anchor the periosteum to the bone. Let's see, within the diaphysis, you can see kind of inside here is where we have some blood vessels. We can see this sort of irregular internal layer, which is called the endosteum. So periosteum is on the outside, endosteum is to the interior here, which covers most of our internal surfaces of the bone. And then the space that is the result of well, basically is lined by the endosteum, is the space within here in the diaphysis is the medullary cavity. And it's the medullary cavity that stores the yellow marrow in adults. All right, now between the epiphysis and diaphysis is a narrow region that we can see highlighted here called the metaphysis. You can see it listed here. The metaphysis is where the epiphyseal plate is located, and the epiphyseal plate is a layer of hyaline cartilage. We don't see it in this image here, but in children, the growing children, the epiphyseal plate is the growth plate. And after growth is completed in long bones, then that hyaline cartilage layer ossifies into this epiphyseal line. So the metaphysis is the location of the epiphyseal plate, or the growth plate, and then eventually in the adult where the epiphyseal line is located. All right. A couple other features that we haven't mentioned is that at the where there is no periosteum, we have articular cartilage at the ends of the bones, at the epiphyses. And as we know, that's hyaline cartilage that makes up the articular cartilage. All right. Oh, one other couple of things to point out, which we can do here as well, is that in the diaphysis, the walls of the diaphysis are formed by what we refer to as compact bone. We see a nice demonstration of that compact bone here, type of bone tissue, whereas in the epiphyses, it looks more like a sponge. That's where we have spongy bone. All right, so we're looking at the internal and external bone coverings. The periosteum, as we mentioned, covers the diaphysis anywhere that we don't have articular cartilage. And that's composed of a fibrous layer of dense, irregular connective tissue, and an inner, that's the outer layer. The inner layer is the cellular layer, which we'll be talking about the cells that make up bone, but specifically we're looking at 3 different kinds of cells that make up this layer that we'll talk about in more detail. So that is, and then the perforating fibers are sort of anchoring that periosteum to the compact bone. We have the similar arrangement in the internal surfaces here, the endosteum. Again, it's composed of dense irregular connective tissue that is rather incomplete. You can see how it's kind of not a fully continuous layer, but also contains several cells that we could have mentioned over here, but we didn't have them illustrated: the osteoprogenitor cells, the osteoblasts, and osteoclasts. So these are the three types of cells that are also part of the endosteum, in addition to the periosteum. And they'll be important for talking about bone development and maintenance. So with that, we'll talk about the different cell types that we find with bone connective tissue. We just looked at 3 of them there, but we'll talk a little bit more about them. So the osteoprogenitor cells, or the stem cells of bone, the osteoblasts produce the extracellular matrix, which we specifically refer to as osteoid, as opposed to when that extracellular matrix becomes calcified, or undergoes calcification by calcium and phosphorus salts. And then osteocytes is another type of cell that's not in the periosteum or the endosteum, but is rather found in compact bone or in the interior of spongy bone plates. We'll talk a little more detail there. And then osteoclasts, which are also in the periosteum and endosteum, and are responsible for bone resorption. So osteoblasts are going to be our bone building cells, and osteoclasts are our bone resorbing cells. So we'll expand on that a little bit here. So we're looking at osteoprogenitor cells, which differentiate into osteoblasts. Osteoprogenitor cells, again, are found within the periosteum as well as the endosteum. When they differentiate into osteoblasts, then we're looking at the bone building cells here. These are the cells that, like chondroblasts, osteoblasts produce the extracellular matrix. Now, we're talking about the uncalcified extracellular matrix that it produces, so that is referred to as osteoid. It's the initial semi-solid organic extracellular matrix that is composed of collagen fibers as well as organic molecules dissolved within a ground substance. Then once the osteoid becomes calcified, then it contains the calcium salts afterwards, which hardens the extracellular matrix. So initially it's not as hard, it's more of a semi-solid matrix, the osteoid is, and then becomes more of a solid, rigid matrix once calcium is deposited. Once the osteoblasts are surrounded by the extracellular matrix that they produce, then they become osteocytes, just like chondroblasts become chondrocytes. So now they're trapped by that extracellular matrix, and you can see they undergo sort of a structural change that we will talk about the significance of shortly here within the context of the surrounding bone tissue. So osteocytes are going to be trapped in a lacunae within the bone matrix, and these processes are going to help the osteocytes communicate with osteoblasts to basically communicate whether there needs to be more additional matrix laid down by the osteoblasts. Now the last is the osteoclasts, which we're looking at up here. Osteoclasts is a really large cell, as you can see, compared to osteoblasts here and osteocytes here. The osteoclasts, remember, form part of the extracellular matrix. I'm sorry, rather, they form part of the periosteum as well as the endosteum. They are multinucleate, and they have the role of bone resorption. And so bone resorption would be important, for example, if more calcium was needed elsewhere in the body. Remember, the bone is storing calcium. So the osteoclasts would resorb bone, meaning releasing the calcium or dissolving that calcium so that it can re-enter the circulatory system and be transported where it's needed. So osteoclasts and osteoblasts have opposite effects. The osteoclasts will resorb bone by releasing hydrochloric acid, which dissolves the mineral components of bone, the calcium and phosphorus. But they also contain a large number of lysosomes, which you can see illustrated here. And the lysosomes release hydrolytic enzymes that break down the organic components of osteoid. So they're kind of dissolving the osteoid, the collagen fibers, the ground substance, and so forth. So that's going to hollow out regions of bone, and that is involved in reshaping or remodeling bone. So the function of osteoblasts and osteoclasts has to be balanced based on physiological need, which is done through hormonal communication. So we'll continue with more on compact and spongy bone in just a minute.